Ivan? There's always activity. Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me bring you up to date on what's happening, and General Wald, in his last briefing here, will give you more details. But in short, the Serb forces continue to stream out of Kosovo. They're taking out some of the last airplanes they had there. They're taking out military equipment, and they're taking out soldiers. And General Wald will have pictures of that for you later. There have been several, yesterday there were several skirmishes between UCK and Yugoslav forces, but they were small and much more limited than the past. We see no signs that there are major engagements, and nor do we see any signs that the UCK is trying to block the Serb forces from leaving. As you know, the NATO forces are poised and ready to move in as soon as Lieutenant General Mike Jackson gives the word. He's the commander of the KFOR, the man on the spot, and the man who will decide when the KFOR forces move into Kosovo. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to General Wald, and then we'll take your questions afterwards.
How many strikes certainly is that? 0. Good figure.
Kind of sticking with tradition, the weather over the next few days will still be pretty good. There's some thunderstorms in the area, some up and down, but shouldn't hinder the ground movement of troops into the area. Just to remind everybody, the chain of command for the KFOR forces, General Clark as the SACEUR still will be in command as the SINC. His theater commander will be Admiral Ellis, Navy Admiral Ellis at Naples, AF South, and then Lieutenant General Jackson will be the ground commander as the ARC commander with, as you can see, 5 major brigade commanders underneath the commanders here with the Brits, the U.S., the French, the Italians, and Germans will all have a general officer in charge of their sectors.
Sir, any thought on where the Russian troops will fit into this wiring diagram?
That's being worked out right now, and they should fit in, I'm sure, with in one of the sectors underneath the unity of command of General Jackson. You know the sectors again, just to remind, the U.S. sector will be at Jelena, the Pristina sector with Sector 5 with the Brits. The French will be up north, the Italians to the western sector, and then the Germans in the southern sector in Persian. The plan of attack so far, entry into force was the 9th, as you know. Yesterday was day 1, and today we're in day 2 now. Just to remind everybody, the VJ MUP should be providing mine and obstacle data to General Jackson and his troops. They have no air or air defense artillery activity is allowed at this point. Obviously, there has been none, although yesterday they thought was a SAM radar come up. They fired 1 HARM missile yesterday early. It turned out that wasn't a SAM, but it landed in the Pristina area, but it wasn't in a populated area.
What was it?
It may have been some kind of other microwave or something, but it was not a SAM.
Today, General, there were reports that they fired a HARM at 2 today and took them out.
No, that's incorrect.
So there's been no
There's
air
been no
defense
air
radar.
defense activity today that they've seen, or any SAM firing or any AAA that they've seen today. By day 3, they should have all their air defense and aircraft and missiles and radars out of Kosovo. And I'll show you some film of them leaving with their MiG-21s that they had left at Pristina in a moment. They're vacating Zone 3 earlier. We showed some of that yesterday. We have an image of that. And then they'll start vacating Zone 1 by day 6, and then move into Zone 2 by day 9, and then out of Zone 3, and fully out of Kosovo by day 11. And then, of course, these forces now are closing into Skopje and ready to go as we speak. The MU, the Task Force Hawk Group, and then General Craddock's headquarters element is closing into Skopje. They're there now. General Craddock is in place. They're moving a lot of the forces from Task Force Hawk via land, as well as helicopter lift, as well as C-17s. I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Are they ready to go now?
To the blue.
Could you just clarify one thing on this chart? You've got vacating Zone 3 on now and also at the very end. What's the difference?
The plan here, as General Shelton and Secretary Cohen mentioned yesterday, is Zone 3 starts vacating as of yesterday. That will make room for other forces to move into Zone 3. And then Zone 1, they'll just vacate kind of a stair step from the south to the north. And so they had to Zone 3 first, get the border group out, and then go from there.
I'm sorry, I have another niggling question. When they vacate Zone 1, they don't actually have to vacate the country, they just have to be out of Zone 1, so they can all be in Zone 2?
That's right.
and Zone, okay.
That's right. So they'll just stair step on up, and they've got 11 days to get it all out.
Marines and the soldiers ready to go?
Yes, they're ready. Matter of fact, there's some of those troops are on the border right now, setting up comm gear, ready to go in. And when General Jackson decides that the time is right, he will go in.
Reports that the British are moving across the border into Kosovo already in order to meet the Russians. Is there any truth to that?
The last we heard just a few minutes ago is that no NATO troops have moved in at this time, nor Russian troops for that matter. And the last we've heard is the Russians have agreed not to move in until General Jackson decides to go in.
On the border of Serbia and Kosovo?
We don't know if there are any there yet. We saw film on TV just like you do of some moving through Belgrade, but the last we heard is the Russians have agreed to go in when General Jackson agrees to take the NATO troops in. Just a reminder, Task Force Hawk will be right under 2,000 soldiers. They've got about half of their tanks in Skopje now. They're moving more in today. They're moving those by C-17. They're moving other equipment by heavy lift CH-47 helicopters as well as UH-60s. Some by road. It's about a 15-hour drive from Tirana over to Skopje, and they're making that over a 2-day period. They stopped last night. They're moving the rest in today. The Marines are all in place in Skopje at this time, and they'll be ready to go when General Jackson says go ahead, well within the time frame they planned for. They all have been there, but they're actually going back and forth doing lift of some of the equipment. But all the U.S. forces are ready to go when General Jackson says go. Okay? I have just one or two images I want to show today. This is the Pristina airfield that we've shown several times before. This is a big, large underground mountain bunker area that we've hit before. I actually did close off the entry points before. And these are taxiways up to the runway. This runway has never been struck. We wanted to keep that open for K4 when they went in. And I'll show you some Predator film today of actually MiG-21s taking off, leaving, 11 of them, and that we figure are probably about the last 11 flyable in that area. There were 40 at that base at the start of this. And we'll show that in just a moment.
Where were they keeping those?
They may have been in part of that bunker, that hill, or dispersed around that area. But like I said, we think they probably had 11 or 12 left, maybe a few more out of 40. This is just a blow up of that area, and you can see they had the taxiway coming out here and here, and that was hit several times, but we're not sure if the whole area was destroyed or if it even was really destroyed inside. The one at Podgorica that we showed before was destroyed inside.
Did you use bunker busters there, no, or not?
They didn't done that one. This is from yesterday. The film was a little washed out. We'll have better film today because of the equipment, but this is the first convoy leaving Zone 3 that we talked about yesterday. Many of those were civilian vehicles. Whether those are civilians or not, we don't know, or if it's military equipment. But the convoys we've seen today, which are numerous, have military and civilian vehicles mixed together, and I'll show you that. Some of the military vehicles have artillery with it. Some are APCs that are driving themselves. And then the rest are some kind of military or civilian vehicles that they're probably using to get equipment out, and who else knows what else.
Do you attach any significance to that, the fact that these civilian vehicles are taking part in the exodus, in that several of the convoys that were hit were initially thought to be military convoys, and then they showed the first civilian? I mean, do you see any kind of connection there? That
I
perhaps
think
all
the
along?
VJ MUP are using any type of vehicle they can. Yesterday we even saw tractors. So whether that's civilians with them or they're actually taking the tractors, I suspect they're probably using civilian vehicles for a lot of the equipment.
But if you go back a couple of months and take what we know now that they are using these guys to exit, does it give you any reason to reevaluate what happened earlier when NATO may or may not have hit
Well, I
civilians
think
in a
most
convoy?
military people thought they were using civilian vehicles all along. That's been a problem, obviously. So, no, it doesn't make me change my opinion of whether they were using civilian vehicles. They were probably using civilian tractors early on, too. They would do anything. They still are. Okay? The film I'll show you now is from Predator of today, and I'll show you several different examples of some of the departures, which they are on a I guess I'd characterize it as a full retreat as we speak. And I'll point out a few of these things. We'll have the film for you later if you like. But it appears they are, and this Pristina is in the Zone 1 area, obviously. This is an earlier one of some of the civilian trucks we talked about earlier. They're queuing up now. Do we think there's military equipment in there? I'm not sure if that's civilian vehicles there leaving with civilian equipment or if that's civilian vehicles with military equipment. I would suspect some of the latter. This is Pristina. Those are the 11 MiGs that I showed you earlier. They've been pulled out today. That was as of 11 o'clock, 11:20 or so Pristina time. Here's another shot of it. 2 have already left. They're getting pre-flighting. You can see the pilots and the equipment. And it appears to me they're trying to demonstrate some professionalism here, which is, I guess they'd try to like to leave with some kind of dignity, but they do seem to be reasonably organized. This is infrared at the same time. You can see the heat source from behind. This one is, it's the same time of the day, but with infrared camera, so white is hot. Taxiing out to the runway. They're taking off two ships, 2 in front, 2 in back in a formation type takeoff. So they all left. This is heading north. They stayed north and they pressed north into the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And all 11 of them left. There was one being towed that's probably not usable. They'll probably try to drive that out in the truck or something. So we're watching them leave from the south. There's some verification of that. This is another convoy. All this film is from around the Pristina area. You can see some military vehicles interspersed in this one, several of them. There were several convoys. Some of this film is of the same convoy I'll show you later, and some close-ups. This is a burning house in that area. Why it's burning, we don't know. Whether it's, this is not a house, but it's a warehouse type facility in the Pristina airfield area. You can speculate they're trying to burn it so somebody else can't use it. That was as of 10:45 Pristina time today. That wasn't caused by bombing or anything, so you suspect it was caused by them setting it. Why, I don't know. Maybe just so the ARC can't use it, or the K4. This is in the same area. These are some railroad fuel tankers that they've obviously had hidden, and they've pulled those up along the road, and they're trying to get gas out of those. Obviously, there's not a lot of gas in the gas stations or other access, so they've husbanded some of their gas. They have enough to get out, it appears. And they're filling both civilian and military vehicles with that. Here's another picture of a convoy here that has military interspersed with civilian, and we'll get some close-ups of some of the vehicles in a minute with towed artillery.
How many clicks between Pristina and the northern border, roughly?
I'm not sure. I haven't. I can find out for you. I think it's.
How long it took a convoy to get out?
It'll probably take about a day once they start rolling. You can see a little closer here that these are obviously military vehicles with military people around them.
Are you surprised at the magnitude of stuff that's coming out of hiding? Did you know it was there?
No, because I'll mention that. Remind me in a second. I want to talk about that. These are actually armored personnel carriers that have wheels on them, so they can go on the roads. Departing, they're actually heading north. Now there's the towed artillery. This is Hunter imagery here. You can see the artillery in the convoy. There's a lot of it. And to answer your question is, I think the numbers that were quoted was like 50% of their artillery and 30 or 40% of their APCs and tanks. So when you look at the numbers, they were high numbers of the amount destroyed, but that would leave half of that left, and that would be what you're seeing now. The remainder of what they had is being towed out.
Is this helping you all learn how better, like, how to identify where these things are hidden for future battles? Like, oh, that's what that lump was. That was
Well, I
an
think
ABC.
the intel, just as we've talked about before, we're not going to talk about specifics, but they're watching very closely, and I think, I know for sure that we have a very good map of the area from the standpoint of where things were or were not, and the air crew and intelligence is very aware of where things may or may not have been. So the intelligence now is obviously a lot better than when we started.
General Wald, I want to ask you again about the Pristina airfield and the underground tunnel there. It seems clear now from what you've shown us today that despite several attacks on that site and closing down, at least temporarily, the ends of the tunnel and even trying to penetrate the bunker, that they were able to successfully keep 11 or 12 MiG-21s in there and pull them out and fly them away.
That's what it appears to me also.
does that raise a question about the tactics or effectiveness of attacking that kind of a bunker, or is that just a more hardened bunker than you
I think
expected?
it's really a hardened bunker. It's actually dug into the side of a mountain that obviously is made out of granite or something, so I'm not surprised at all that a 2,000-pounder wouldn't penetrate a mountain.
No, you said they didn't use a 5,000-pound bomb on this side.
I don't believe they did on that one.
Why not, in retrospect?
I don't know why they didn't. I don't know what the targeting was there. But I think one thing, going back again on Pristina, is the ARC and NATO had an intention of using Pristina. They still do after the fact. So that's why the runway wasn't destroyed, et cetera. So, and I'm not sure. I think they probably closed the mouth of both of the tunnels, and once it's inside, it doesn't really matter.
Was there an incorrect battle damage assessment, though, that initially rated that bunker as being destroyed and only now discovered that it wasn't?
I don't think I ever read they thought everything inside that was destroyed. Matter of fact, it was just the contrary. The one at Podgorica that you saw blow up, that I think the Navy hit, there is verification that the Galebs that were inside there, and there were numbers up to 25 or so, were destroyed. So, but I never did hear a report or read a report in intelligence that said they thought they destroyed things inside Pristina.
General, is there enough sea lift in place to get the main force out of Bremerhaven on time?
Yes. The Bob Hope is there, and they'll be loading it onto the Bob Hope, and that'll be steaming around with the remainder of not the remainder, but the replacement force from Germany.
General, what's the status of current operations? Are we still flying CAP? What kinds of planes are flying what missions?
They're flying as we speak. They're flying combat air patrol. They're flying intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with the assets you would use for that, AWACS, J-STARS. You've seen Predator and Hunter. They're flying aircraft loaded with bombs in the vicinity of Kosovo. And so when General Jackson, if he needs them, they'll be available on a very short notice.
Based on some of the pictures you're seeing, General, of the types of equipment that are being moved out and the aircraft that remain, are you able to make an assessment of what kind of fighting force Milosevic has in his possession after this campaign?
I think they'll know more as we go along. We see more equipment leave, but I think the intelligence estimates are probably going to end up about what we thought it was at the start or at the end of this. Really, that the destruction of his equipment and force is probably going to end up about what we thought it was, which is, as General Shelton and Secretary Cohen talked about yesterday, that was. And I can go through all the numbers if you want, but a lot. And depends on which ones you're talking about. But the frontline MiG-29s obviously in the high 80, 90 percentile. MiG-21s themselves, I think it was 30-some% destroyed. Galeb's about 35, 40%. You can go down the list all the way. And I think we'll find out those numbers were pretty accurate. They did have indications today of them also pulling out SA-6 or SAM equipment and radars also, and that was on German TV. So it appears they're following up on that portion of their requirement as well. But as they go out, I know there's going to be a lot of questions. Can you count them as they go? And I don't think we have anybody sitting there counting pieces. But as the ARC and the KFOR go in, there will be more and more information that they will find.
But I guess more than the numbers, do you have an idea of whether this force still constitutes or could constitute a significant threat to, say, his neighbors?
We don't know that yet. My estimation would be I doubt very seriously if his force is in shape to try to do anything outside of the fry right now, mainly because they've been in the field for a long time, taking a pretty heavy pounding. I'm not sure their sustainability. It looks like they're having trouble finding fuel. I'm not sure what their equipment for ammunition status is or their ability to even support the vehicles. We've heard indications they're asking for, as General Shelton yesterday mentioned, for mechanics to come down and try to help get things out. So I don't think that's the way anybody would want to start a combat situation with a force in that shape.
General Wald, given that, has anybody heard from the Serbs that they need more time to get out yet?
Not yet. Looks like they're trying hard to make the time frame.
And two other questions. Is it still the plan that even though U.S. forces are ready, they will follow the Brits, the French, and the other NATO forces in?
Well, I think there's as you saw the geography of the sectors, it would make sense for the NATO force, and this General Jackson's call, to phase in with a force that would go north to go first. It wouldn't make sense for somebody to go in south and then have somebody try to go by them. So I think they're all going to go together. I would suspect there will be some U.S. forces that will go into the headquarters with General Jackson. They're part of the ARC. We have those members that are U.S. members of his headquarters staff, as you recall from before. So this is not a U.S. NATO or not a U.S. UK French German type competition. They're all under the KFOR.
But you mentioned, I think, that there are some U.S. troops on the border today setting up comm facilities.
There are KFOR troops setting them up.
How close to the border are U.S. troops today?
Well, I imagine they're pretty close with the rest of KFOR.
And could they go in? Could U.S. troops go in?
If General Jackson wanted them to go in, they could go in as we speak. But he feels the time will be right when he's ready. And I bet if you saw General Shelton's chart yesterday, it was 48 to 72 hours from the time this thing was initiated where they'd go in. We're still well within that cycle, and there shouldn't be any problem.
To your knowledge, what are the factors that General Jackson has to consider before he starts flowing any of these forces in?
I think he wants to make sure that we don't lose any of the troops unnecessarily, get them hurt for any reason. There's no sense in that. Obviously, the Serbs are leaving, even though there's been some skirmishing along the border with the UCK and the VJ MUP earlier. That's dying down. So there doesn't seem to be a rush from the standpoint of getting in there and not making sure the roads are cleared, the mines are cleared, that it's safe for the folks to get in. I don't think anybody would expect anybody to rush in right now and do something that we'd regret later. So he's going to make sure it's all set, ready to go with force protection, and the roads are clear, and then he'll do it at his own pace.
Along those lines, what is the progress of Serb withdrawal from Zone 1? Have they begun moving people out at this point, or what are they doing?
What I just showed you is all Zone 1.
Southern Zone?
Right. Pristina is part of Zone 1, where there's kind of a loop that comes up through, as you know, that isn't necessarily way down south. And that area, Pristina is all in that area. They're moving it out.
General, with regard to the Russians that we're seeing moving through Belgrade, are you saying nobody in the Pentagon knows where those troops are now?
Oh, I'm sure somebody knows where they are. I don't know exactly, but I know I saw them driving through Belgrade. But from what I understand, they have agreed. Secretary Albright has talked to Ivanov, and he has assured her that the Russian troops will not go into Kosovo until General Jackson agrees that they'll all go in.
Ken, do you have any better idea where those troops are now?
Yeah, let me just clarify that. What Minister Ivanov has told Secretary Albright is that the Russian troops will stay out of Kosovo until they have reached an agreement on the command and control situation for the Russian troops. In other words, the circumstances under which Russian troops would serve in KFOR. We believe it would be very useful for the Russians to serve in Kosovo. They obviously believe that too, and Secretary Talbot is now in Moscow working out the arrangements.
Series of questions on these Russian troop movements. One, was the movement of the Russian troops out of Bosnia a surprise to the Pentagon and to NATO? Is the command and control of the troops of the stabilization force in Bosnia such that the Russians have the option to pack up and leave whenever they see fit? Where have things progressed in terms of an agreement for those troops to take part in the KFOR?
Well, answering those questions in reverse order, the talks in Moscow are continuing. Secretary Talbot's there with three U.S. generals. One is Lieutenant General Fogelsong, another is Brigadier General Casey, a colleague of General Wald's in the Policy and Plans Division of the Joint Staff, and the third is Brigadier General Dayton, who is the defense attaché in Moscow. Those talks continue, and there have been talks as of several hours ago. I don't know whether they're ongoing right now, but they were ongoing several hours ago. In terms of the Russian troops in S4 in Bosnia, there are approximately 1,300 Russian troops there. They did notify S4, the stabilization force, early this morning that they plan to dispatch a small element of their force, approximately 200 soldiers, into Yugoslavia in order to operate as an advance party. And they told S4 that those troops would return, that they would perform some advance work for other Russian forces coming into Yugoslavia, and they would return to their S4 duties. Several hours after they alerted S4 to their plans, they did in fact leave. And we estimate that there are a little under 200 who left. and moved into Yugoslavia, where they remain.
Did NATO commanders put the KFOR troops on a higher state of alert or prepare to move them in because of the movement of the Russian troops and then stand down once the NATO received assurances from Moscow the troops would not move in without an agreement?
I'm not aware that that's the case. General Jackson has been organizing his troops to prepare them for an entry into Kosovo, and he'll do that, as he said yesterday very clearly, when he chooses to do it. And he may not announce it ahead of time.
So there wasn't an order to go and then an order to wait and to go to later instead?
I think if there'd been an order to go, they would have gone, since they were right next to the border.
And aside from the few skirmishes, what's the situation with the KLA? Are they standing down as far as you know?
Yes, as far as I know, they are honoring their agreement not to interfere with the exit of the Serb troops. Yes.
What inside Russia, inside the Russian military, what other preparations are you seeing them make in terms of training and other things to assemble a longer-term peacekeeping force for Kosovo?
Well, they have announced that they're training some troops, and I take them at their word. They have announced that they're prepared to send a rather large contingent of troops to Kosovo. We have said we would welcome Russian participation as long as it meets the terms that are actually laid out in the package of documents passed by the United Nations Security Council yesterday, and that is that there be unified command. That's what the discussion is about now in Moscow. How do we work out an arrangement that works for NATO by preserving unified command and works for Russia as well?
And there's not a zone for the Russians yet, is there? That hasn't been decided either. My second question is, was any of this movement by the Russians anticipated by NATO until, the time that they got the notice?
We had some anticipation that something like this could occur, yes. In terms of a zone, it is true that the exact location of where the Russians will go in Kosovo has not yet been worked out. That's one of the issues that Secretary Talbot's negotiating in Moscow now.
Can you walk through some of the non-traditional soldiering and non-traditional tasks the Peace Force, KFOR, will be involved with? I'm thinking of setting up city governments, arbitrating disputes about homes, feeding, providing water, just some of those non-traditional civilian types of activities NATO will
Well, I think you've
perform.
just listed a lot of tasks that will be performed primarily by civil authorities. If you read the UN Security Council resolution, it clearly envisions two types of forces going to Kosovo. The first is KFOR, the peacekeeping force, and the second is a civil reconstruction force that will not only help to rebuild, but will help govern, will help set up institutions that any society needs to run itself, law enforcement institutions, courts, etc. What the KFOR forces will do when they go in is set up. Their primary job is to establish a safe and secure environment, and that is the foundation on which everything else has to be based. The humanitarian workers can't do their jobs without a safe and secure environment. The Kosovo Albanians will not return home unless they believe the environment is safe and secure. So that's the fundamental task that confronts KFOR as they move in. They will obviously go through the military tasks of setting up base camps, establishing supply lines, establishing force protection envelopes, setting up patrols that will go from village to village to check out the security situation. As I said the other day, they'll also set up joint military committees similar to the ones that we have in Bosnia. These committees have turned out to be extremely important ways for the military to establish day-to-day communications with local officials, whether they're county, town, village officials, to work out the types of arrangements that have to be worked out anytime you have a military force living side by side with civilians, and also laying down rules of the road, working out a whole variety of things about troop movements, protection, that type of thing, rules of behavior to a certain extent. Obviously, these troops will not only do the peacekeeping, but they will do a certain amount of humanitarian assistance. Let me give you an example. The United States Air Force in Europe is already planning on the possibility of airdropping significant numbers of humanitarian daily rations into Kosovo. They've lined up a number of C-130s, which are prepared to launch airdrops within 2 days of the entry of the peacekeeping force, and they could drop as many as 84,000 humanitarian daily rations a day for several days in order to get food quickly to the internally displaced people who have been in the hills for the last almost 3 months. So that's the type of humanitarian activity that the forces would perform.
Water, I know UCOM has a dedicated water unit actually that's been trained to go down to Africa and provide these reverse osmosis machines
Well,
for portable water.
one of the things we'll do obviously is take an inventory of what the problems are and then try to respond to those problems as quickly as possible. If the problems are acute, problems of starvation, problems of dehydration, problems of lack of health care, the military would be prepared to address those problems on a short-term basis. Over time, it's much more appropriate for civilian authorities and NGOs to deal with these basically civilian services. That's not the military's comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage is providing security.
Now that you're in a different type of mission, Ken, do you anticipate going back to Congress with a revised or new budget request to cover what's coming up, or has all this been figured into the original planning that was done weeks?
No, as Secretary Cohen said yesterday, the supplemental that was passed did not contain money to pay for KFOR. It contained money to pay for the air campaign. There were some humanitarian funds in there, but they were generally retroactive. They were to pay for the Hurricane Mitch reconstruction and some other activities. I think there might have been some money for the State Department in there that addressed the problems in the future in Kosovo, but not for the military. So two things will happen. First, we will look at the amount of money we have left and the amount of money we've saved by ending the air war on June 10th rather than September 30th, because the funding went through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. So to the extent that there's significant savings, and I don't know that there will be or there will not be, some of that money could be applied to the KFOR costs. Obviously, we have a very strong interest in the military, General Wald, others, Secretary Cohen, General Shelton, in not having to rob readiness and maintenance accounts to pay for the KFOR operation. So we will do our best to protect the readiness funds, the procurement funds that have been fought for so hard by this administration, and we will take appropriate action to make sure that we don't get into those funds to pay for KFOR.
General Wald, President Clinton today gave an interesting statistic about the B-2. He said it had flown 1% of the sorties, but dropped 11% of the bombs, of the munitions. Is that the figure that you have? And can you explain a little bit why, about the B-2's capabilities, why it was able to drop a disproportionate number of bombs?
I don't know the number of the percentage. I think what I think was fascinating about the B-2 is it dropped probably on some of the very, very significant targets a high percentage of the bombs. I don't know if it's, I think if he said that's the number, I believe it. But I will say this much, that there are a lot of people that, and for those that didn't know much about the B-2, and particularly that hadn't seen it fly, questioned whether it was going to work or not. And it came across like gangbusters. And I think the JDAM was a star of the campaign, as well as the B-2. And the other one, too, is the B-52. That did drop a significant amount of the bombs, as you know, 44 per aircraft, and they all were, I think it did away with the term dumb bomb. So I think the President's real proud of all the guys that did their job and saw the B-2 up front today.
Do you anticipate that the Air Force might change its position on acquisition of more B-2s based on the performance of the plane in this conflict?
I don't know what the Air Force plan for the B-2 is in the future. I know they plan to have 20 of them. They'll all be capable, and I guess if you did the math, 20 times 16 targets is a lot right off the bat, so it shows it's got a great capability to come from the CONUS and drop almost any place in the world on high-value targets under the worst conditions, so it's pretty impressive.
More B-2s? Do you need more B-2s?
I'll point out, Jamie, that we never flew more than 2 B-2s at a time, so that was 10% of the force in in action at any one time, and I think we showed that we have an adequate number of B-2s to perform the types of challenges faced during Operation Allied Force.
Thank you.
Can you vote, you've raised the Bosnia peacekeeping model as how the Russian coordination with NATO might work. Can you briefly tell us how does that work, and would you expect the same thing in Kosovo?
Well, I would expect something akin to it. Whether it'll be exactly the same remains for Secretary Talbot and his Russian counterparts to work out. The way that works is that the Russians serve in an American sector, and they report to an American general. They also report to a Russian general who was embedded in SHAPE headquarters in Mons, although he has left recently, but presumably he can come back. And this way they have basically taken their commands from a Russian or from a U.S. general. They have basically they are given their orders through a U.S. chain of command, and if they accept the orders, they go off and do them, as they have done the vast majority of the times. If they find an order that is distasteful for some reason or that offends their principles, then they have said, we won't do that, but we will stand aside to allow other S4 forces to perform the mission, and that has happened in one or two cases. So this has worked actually quite smoothly, and I think the Russian troops have been very pleased by how they've been treated in their sector, and certainly the American commanders, including American secretaries of defense who have visited the Russian troops, have been very pleased and impressed by the quality of the troops that the Russians have sent and by the quality of the work they've done as peacekeepers in Bosnia.
Thank you.
Ken, what's the thinking about when U.S. forces that are not part of KFOR will begin coming home? And also, will the TR battle group, which was diverted to this operation when it was originally scheduled to go to the Arabian Gulf, will it now go on to the Arabian Gulf?
Those are both good questions. I know of no indication that the TR is about to be diverted to the Gulf, but we'll check into that. Obviously, there's another carrier in the Gulf. I think that we will probably want to keep the TR on station for at least a while longer. It would only be prudent to make sure that the withdrawal takes place as we think it is and as planned. In terms of the other forces, that's entirely up for General Clark to decide at some appropriate time. Obviously, he'll decide to release a number of the Air Forces and Naval Forces, and maybe also some of the Army forces in the area that aren't directly connected with KFOR. But that's a question for SACEUR, General Clark, to decide. And I suspect that he's been thinking primarily about deploying KFOR into Kosovo right now, and he'll think later in the next several weeks about what to do with the other forces.
The Predator video shown today it showed a warehouse burning. Do you have any other evidence of the Serbs laying waste to parts of Kosovo as they leave? Any other imagery or other evidence?
We did see some other pictures of burning buildings in Predator films yesterday. I'd have to say there aren't a lot of them that we've seen, but we have seen some. Of course, it's hard to know when you encounter a burning building from a UAV like the Predator how it started to burn. We know one thing: NATO wasn't responsible for it. But other than that, we don't know the circumstances. There have been reports from the Kosovar Liberation Army that a few, or at least one of the VJ units has laid a few mines as it was going out, but we are not, overwhelmingly, the reports we get, overwhelmingly, is that the evacuation is taking place quickly and in compliance with the rules laid out by the military technical agreement. And I would have to say that the story here is that the withdrawal is happening speedily and in compliance with the rules. Sure.
No briefing tomorrow. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, I have a briefing tomorrow at 11. This is General Wald's last briefing, though, and I thank him for the great job that he's done. And at 11 tomorrow.